Welcome to World History, and today we're going to be going over imperialism, and this follows chapter 33 in your AP World History book. This is when Europeans were in search of natural resources. And just remember, little catchphrases: stealing is cheaper than dealing. And that's kind of the summary of what happens here. The factories of the Industrial Revolution that you read in earlier chapters created useful products, but in order to make these products, they required natural resources. Europe had its share of coal and iron ore used to provide power and make equipment for factories, but raw materials such as cotton and rubber had to be imported because they didn't grow in the climates of Western Europe. So industrial nations amassed incredible wealth by colonizing regions with natural resources and then taking these resources without compensating the natives. They would take these to Europe. The resources were then sent back where they were made into finished products. After they were made into finished products, the industrial nations sent the finished products back to the colonies, where the colonists had to purchase them because the colonial powers wouldn't let the colonies themselves trade with anyone else. So in short, the colonial powers became rich at the expense of the colonies. The more colonies a nation had, the richer it became. So pretty soon Europe colonized nations on every other continent in the world. Europe became the clearinghouse for raw materials from around the globe, while the rest of the world increasingly became exposed to Europe and European ideas. And what's more, the need for raw materials transformed the landscape of the conquered regions. Limited raw materials depleted faster than any other time in human history. So the Industrial Revolution, in addition to creating the problems of pollution that you read about in the previous chapters, also began to have an impact on the environment by beginning to gobble up the natural resources. And that was one of the main drives of imperialism. So now we'll look at what are called the motives or the justification for imperialism. Many people at this time supported colonizing foreign lands. Most Europeans were very ethnocentric, which means they looked at their culture as the main culture, as the dominant culture. They viewed other cultures as barbarian, uncivilized, and this ethnocentrism may have driven the social advancements within Europe itself. When you see yourself as civilized, you can't really brutalize your own people, therefore you can do this to other people. The first thing that contributed to this was the idea of social Darwinism. There was a group of people called social Darwinists who applied Charles Darwin's theory of evolution and natural selection to society, to sociology. They claimed that the dominant races or classes of people rose to the top through a process of survival of the fittest. And because Britain was the most powerful, it was the most fit, and therefore the British were superior to other races. So this was a sort of justification for racism, and kind of a justification saying that the stronger cultures had the right to dominate the weaker cultures, because in this theory of natural selection, the strongest will survive. And secondly, not only did people in Europe consider themselves to be superior, but they also felt they had a moral obligation to dominate other people. Okay, and that's a nice way of putting it. In other words, they felt it was their obligation to teach other people how to be more quote-unquote civilized, or more like Europeans. One of these people summed it up, Rudyard Kipling, with his poem, The White Man's Burden. And that becomes known as one of the justifications of imperialism, so you need to understand what the white man's burden are. As Europeans began to dominate the rest of the world to advance their economies and their egos as well, competing with each other, trying to be the dominant country, trying to have more colonies, Kipling talked about this as a burden, in which it was the duty of the Europeans to conquer the people who were inferior to them. And as he quoted it, half devil and half child. So therefore, that they could convert them to Christianity and civilize them in the European fashion. Never mind, these people didn't ask to be civilized, quote unquote, but the Europeans felt they knew what was best. So it was seen as the white man's burden. It was their burden because they had this intelligence, they had this superiority, that therefore they had to share this with other people. And so that was one of the characteristics, one of the motives, of imperialism. And it really hits the point of ethnocentrism in Europe. And remember, Europe wasn't the only region that had ethnocentrism. If you remember the Chinese, when they saw themselves as the Middle Kingdom, the center of the world, they saw the Europeans as barbarians. So the similar attitudes existed before in other areas. Similar attitudes existed in Japan and in most civilizations at one point or another. So the Europeans weren't unique, but their ability to act on that made it unique, made it dangerously unique. Previous cultures, like the Chinese, the Japanese, they didn't seek to dominate the world in the aspect that the Europeans were doing, and they weren't armed with the most technologically advanced militaries as you saw in the 19th century. So they also had the strong economic motives, and the Europeans were very capable of subjugating people who they considered inferior or barbaric, and their success at doing so reinforced the ethnocentric attitudes, leading to further colonialism. So you have the economic motive of the desire for more resources and more markets to sell your products. You have the cultural motives of you are superior and the white man's burden. And then you also have political motives. This was an era where nationalism was growing throughout Western Europe. And one of the ways to establish national pride is to show your citizens that you are the dominant country, you are the best in the world. And the way you prove that is by having colonies. And so the more colonies a country had, the more pride it instilled in their country, in their countrymen, because they saw themselves as the most powerful country in the world. So there was also political motives. It was this quest for national hegemony, this quest to try to make themselves, make their people feel like they were living in the best country. So that was definitely a motive as well. The final motive driving imperialism was what is called the missionary motive or the missionary impulse as a justification for imperialism. And even before the age of imperialism, remember the Jesuits in the early modern periods went to African and Asian lands in search of converts. During the period of neo-imperialism or this new imperialism, you also had spiritual campaigns that provided a religious justification. Missionaries often facilitated communication between the imperialists and the subject people, and they sometimes provided European officials with information they needed to maintain control of these overseas colonies. So missionary settlements served as convenient meeting places for Europeans overseas and the distribution centers for European goods. So you also had that as one of the motives. And then what you had making it possible were the tools of imperialism, what the technology that they had that made it available. You had, first of all, advanced weapons, the military technology. Because Europeans were industrialized, or Western Europeans were industrialized, they were producing mass quantities of powerful weapons. And by the late 1800s, they adopted the Maxim gun, a light and powerful weapon that fired 11 bullets per second. So all of these technologies, all these military technologies gave European armies a much deadlier advantage over the people they were subjugating. Another technology was transportation technologies. The most important innovation involved steamships and railroads. These allowed the Europeans to build up bigger navies, and then add to that the steel technology and the military technology that they could put on these ships. European navies became much more dominant, and that would definitely play a factor, especially as the Europeans wanted better transportation routes. This plays a role with the Europeans dealing in the Suez Canal and also in the Panama Canal in the Americas. So once imperialists had gained control of overseas lands, railroads helped them to maintain their hegemony and to organize local economies to their own advantage. Railroad transportation also enabled colonial officials and armies to travel quickly through the colonies and facilitated the trade of raw materials from the interior. So you also saw more widespread involvement, especially in Africa, unlike in the first era of colonialism in the 1500s, where the Europeans mostly stayed on the African coast. Because of these technologies, they're now able to go a lot more inland for these resources. And then the final tool of the technology of this time were communications technologies, particularly the telegraph, which made it possible to exchange messages even faster than in the past. And this allowed the Europeans to get messages of what needed to be done, especially when it came to the subject lands. Imperial officials could rapidly mobilize their forces to deal with troubles. Merchants could respond quicker to the developments that were economically or commercially significant because of their ability to communicate faster. So make sure you listen into the next section, because the next section will deal with some examples of imperialism. So this was just a quick overview of the motives and what made all this possible.